Hey, welcome back. Glad you made it to the last lesson of this section. We're going to do a quick code review. We applied some styling to make it look better, created a little bit of HTML so that we've got some basic structure that we can begin interacting with using JavaScript. And then when we came to JavaScript, we tried to focus the bulk of the course obviously on JavaScript because this is a JavaScript project course, setting up a main global variable that we use to contain all of the dynamic values that we're going to need within our gameplay. So we're starting it off by setting up a couple different values, so a minimum and a maximum for our random number. So these can be also updated and changed as needed to make the dynamic functionality of the game. All of the main gameplay started whenever the DOM was loaded, and once that loaded, we loaded the elements into the game object. So we've got that global variable that's going to contain all of the values that are going to be changing throughout the gameplay. So we've got all of the elements selected here so we can easily access them. We've got the number of guesses being tracked in here. And this is a global value, so it's always changing, always updating as the player is playing the game. We can also dynamically change the minimum and maximum values if needed. And then we've got the number that was randomly generated and that the user has to guess. So the objective is that the user inputs their guesses and we compare it with the value that's being guessed, and we determine if the player got the value correct, and if not, then we send them back to continue guessing. And we give them a little bit of a hint whether it's higher or lower. So once we selected the elements, we needed some interaction, and that was the event listener on the click button, because of course the objective of the game is to click to enter in a guess and to click that button. And then we also had an init function that set up some of the game structure. So we set up the number of guesses in the object. We also generated a random number that the user needs to guess. Then we sent in a message to the player to guess a number and outputting the game minimum and maximum values so that the user can see and get the parameters that they need to work within for the gameplay. Creating a function to send messages, because we've got quite a few messages that we're communicating back to the player, so we've got a function for that. And what this function does is it updates the inner HTML of the message area, so that's this little area up here. Also updating the color text in that message area, and then updating the border color of the input, so that's updating that, turning it blue, as well as we've got the background color of the button. That's updating. And we also have if CLR comes in as false, if there's no value there, then we've got some default values that we're setting. And we also updating the color of the button as well. So that's what we set up for the message. And we continuously use message multiple times within the code. So once the game starts, it waits for the user to take action to enter in a value into the input area. And once that value is entered in, they click the button to create their guess. So the guess is where all of the game logic sits. So we've got whenever the user clicks that guess button, it's invoking a function called guess value. And within that guess value, we're doing a check to see if that button contains a class of replay. And if it does, that means that the player is in a replay mode where they're playing a next round of the game. So that's where we need to rebuild the init, so rebuild the number they're guessing at. And we also update some of the values. And then we're updating the button contents to be guess, as well as some of the other values that we reset when the game was over. We need to reset them back to the play styles and values. We increment, and if it's not, replay in the button. This way we can use the same button, or we could have had two buttons, one that does the replay and then one that shows whenever we're doing guesses. So we increase the guesses if the user is making a guess. We get the guess value, we clear out the value of the guess, so there's always no value in there after the guess has been sent through. We make sure that we're converting the guess value of the input into an integer. As with forms, typically the content comes in within a string format in JavaScript. And JavaScript does have dynamic types, so it can switch between numbers and strings, but it's always good to kind of force it to a number. And then this is also where we can check to see if the temp guess is a number. And if it's not, then we're sending back an error message to the player that they need to enter in digits, so we make everything red so it really stands out as an error. Next, we check to see if the player has won, if they've guessed the number correctly, and if they have, then we pass over a message to the player that they've won and how many guesses it took, what they essentially scored, and then we run our game over function. And the game over function really just resets the gameplay to be the start value, as well as it sets it up to rebuild the game. So we've got restart game, we hide the input because at this point we don't need an input, and we also add that class of replay to the button so that next time the player clicks the button, we can check if this class exists, and if it does, then we know that that restart was the one that was clicked. We also update the game max, so making the game more difficult every round, every time they solve it. It's going to have a larger spread between the numbers. So that's what happens when they get it correct. If they don't have it correct, then we check to see if the guess value is larger than the game number. And if it is, then we pass in a message that it should be lower their guess. And if it's not, then we pass in a message that's higher. We also set some of the color defaults, passing it into message, all of those values that then, of course, we utilize updating the style properties of several of the elements on the page. And then the game continuously loops, so the design of the game is to constantly put it back to the player, to add their guesses and try to guess the hidden number in as few guesses as possible. Thanks again for taking this course and for taking this section, building the number guessing game. I've included all of the source code so you can try it out for yourself, experiment with it, extend on it, have some fun with it, and practice using and manipulating DOM elements using JavaScript.